Hey, advanced procrastinators. Here we are talking about the Vietnam War for the fourth time in my installment here. And we're talking about the end of the Vietnam War. And here's the focus learning target for the day. Given that the US was originally in Vietnam to stop the spread of communism in South Vietnam beginning in 1964, students are going to evaluate the behavior and actions of the United States government after 1968, which would have been when the Tet Offensive took place and the election of 1968 took place, in relation to the purpose why the U.S. was fighting a war in Vietnam. Now, students are going to explain how the U.S. was or was not living up to those ideas. So, as we mentioned before, the Democrats in the election of 1968 had Robert Kennedy running for the election as an anti-war candidate, but Robert Kennedy was assassinated. So the Democrats selected Hubert Humphreys, who was actually a pro-Vietnam War Democrat. So if you're a young person and you are against the Vietnam War, if you vote Democratic, you're voting for a candidate who supports the Vietnam War. Now, we have an alternative in America. You can always vote for the other political party. And who did the Republicans nominate for their candidate? They nominated Richard Nixon. And Richard Nixon was in favor of the Vietnam War. He was also strong anti-crime, anti-hippie, and anti-counterculture. So if you're a young person in America at this time, you are definitely not going to vote for Richard Nixon if you are against the Vietnam War. But at the same time, you're also stuck with voting for a pro-war Democratic candidate. Now, in order for Nixon to win the election, he had two strategies of why he won. One was he called it the silent majority. Nixon stated that actually the larger percentage of Americans were in favor of the Vietnam War. Okay, the larger percent of Americans supported him, not the radical protesters. And the reason why there was so much attention put on the radical protesters is that the hippies and the counterculture young kids were all unemployed and they had free time to go out and protest. Normal Americans were busy working and raising families, and these normal Americans were fearful of the changing values that the hippies were trying to promote. Also, Nixon basically begins a strategy that Republicans still use today in order to help themselves win elections, which is the Southern strategy. Is Nixon was using racism and demagoguery. He was using the fear of hippies, the fear of black civil rights, the fear of the changing values of free love and drug use, right, to attract conservative Democratic white voters in the South to vote Republican. And from this moment on in 1968, the South is going to switch from being a Democratic stronghold because white Southerners still remember that Lincoln freed the slaves, and Lincoln, even 104 years earlier, was a Republican. They vote Democratic. Now, with Nixon, white Southerners in the South are going to vote Republican even till the present day. So Richard wins the election, and now we have a president who is pro-war, anti-communist, anti-hippie, and conservative, old school. And now predict what will happen in Vietnam now that Nixon is president. And the answer is the war will continue for another 5 years. The war is only 4 years old at this time, and it's going to go on for another 5, if not 6 more years. Okay. Even though Nixon, when he ran for the presidency, he said he had a secret plan to end the war. Yes, we were not going to get out immediately, but he had a way that we were going to get out of Vietnam. That's what he campaigned on, right? And his plan was called Vietnamization, right? This is the plan. And the idea was let the South Vietnamese troops take more responsibility and more fighting for the war. All right. And Nixon's slogan of the United States pulling out of the war was called peace with honor, right? This was a way for the United States to start pulling troops out of South Vietnam, because by 1968 there was almost 600,000 troops in South Vietnam, so pulling those numbers down without it making us look like we're losing the war. We're not losing, we're achieving peace with honor, right? Now, as I said, the war in Vietnam is going to continue for 5 more years under Nixon's presidency, right? And think about this. Why could the U.S. just not simply get up and leave Vietnam and say, hey, it's not going good. Let's just go home? And there are several answers to this. The obvious answer is number one, the United States had never, ever lost a war before. And Vietnam is the first war America is going to lose, in the sense that we did not achieve our goal going into the war, which was to stop the spread of communism in Vietnam, because Vietnam becomes communist when we're done. Another reason why we just couldn't get up and leave is because we've invested so much in Vietnam. To pull up and leave would be a waste of all the manpower, the lives, the money, all those things that we put into it. Also, a third reason why America could not get out of Vietnam is the fact that the domino theory. Communism could possibly spread in South Vietnam, and communism was still a threat to the United States at this time. So the fear was, wow, if we do get up, Cambodia and Laos and Thailand and Indonesia, they might all follow afterwards and become communists as well too. Now, what's going to make America look even worse, though, is we're fighting this war to try to prevent communism from spreading in South Vietnam. But you're going to see some actions, and Americans start seeing actions by the United States government that are going to make Americans think, and the world, that are we really doing what's best in South Vietnam? And one of them is the My Lai Massacre, right? Now, this was basically U.S. troops go into a village and they slaughtered well over 200 women, children, and some men. Now, this took place before Nixon became president in 1968, but it became published in Life magazine in 1969, right? Um, Now, keep this in mind. This was not the only massacre where Americans went into a village and killed everybody in the village. I mean, one problem with a lot of young people was the fact that every time they go into a village, the villagers would say, USA number one, Charlie number 10, meaning they're in favor of America and they're not for the Viet Cong. But that same villager would then go into the jungle at night and fight against Americans. America had no idea of knowing who the enemy was, right? Now, even though this was an event that was the result of American soldier pressures and being 19 years old in Vietnam, right? The importance of this was when Americans saw these images, it shocked and disgusted Americans, right? Remember, we're here to protect the Vietnamese people. And what we're doing here is we're massacring and killing the Vietnamese people, right? And explain this, what kind of impact is this behavior going to have on the US and the world's impression of America? And the answer is, right, America in this war does not look like we are living up to our ideals of equality, of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? The people you see in these images, they had their inalienable rights taken away by American troops because American troops might have been frustrated or scared or worried or trying to fight a war. We are in Vietnam to protect the Vietnamese people. We are saving them from communism. And what this looked like is we're actually there killing them all. And that's not the goal of this war for the United States. Second thing America is going to do under Nixon is he is going to invade Cambodia and bomb Cambodia, right? Now, keep this in mind, right? Nixon said he was going to go into the presidency and pull us out of the war and had a secret plan to get out. But what's happening here is Nixon's bombing of Cambodia is escalating the war, not withdrawing it as he promised, right? And this is going to be important because, one, we're not at war with Cambodia, right? This is the way that the South Vietnamese or the Viet Cong got supplies from the North. So it did make sense militarily to bomb Cambodia because what was happening in Cambodia was aiding our enemy. But the problem was this instability, this invasion is going to lead to instability in Cambodia. And Pol Pot, who will take over, is going to kill over 2 million of his own people. And what's going to happen in America is protests are going to follow because, one, we're not at war with Cambodia, yet we're bombing Cambodia. And number two, a lot of Americans are tired of this war. And it looks like this war is actually escalating. So was Nixon right to bomb Cambodia? And the answer is, right, as I said before, you could say militarily, yes. The North Vietnamese army was smuggling supplies into South Vietnam by way of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and that went through Cambodia. So by bombing Cambodia, we were trying to stop the flow of supplies that were helping the Viet Cong in South Vietnam, right? But the bombing of Cambodia is going to destabilize Cambodia, right? And Pol Pot will take over and have arguably the most successful systematic genocide of the 20th century. And the fact that he kills almost 1/3 of his own population, which is even worse because Pol Pot didn't go out and kill another group of people like Hitler was killing a group of people, the Jews, that he felt were the enemy. Pol Pot is killing his own people, Cambodians, just that they were older Cambodians that might not be brainwashed as easily as younger people. So it led to the bombings of Cambodia, led to a whole generation of Cambodians being slaughtered. As I said, the bombings of Cambodia led to protests in America. And the most infamous one was Kent State University in Ohio. Now, what happens at Kent State is there is a protest, obviously, against the bombings of Cambodia. The National Guard was called in order to break up the protests, and the National Guard actually brought with them live rounds and bullets, right? And they opened fire on the student protesters. 4 students were shot dead, 9 were wounded, right? Now, these images hit America, and analyze now, figure out who is the real enemy now in this war for Americans in 1970. Is it the Vietnamese and the communists, or is it the US government? And the answer here for a lot of people, especially young Americans who are against the war, is the enemy here is not the communists or the Vietnamese. They're not killing Americans. The US government, right, or the National Guard just went out and killed young Americans, right? And the purpose of government is to protect people. And also remember that these young Americans were simply college students participating in their First Amendment right, which is freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. And for freedom of assembly, right, they were killed. Now, ironically, at the time, a lot of people felt that the protesters at Kent State were in the wrong, especially in conservative United States. But looking back nowadays, people can look at this and say, wow, this was the government opening fire on young Americans, who, by the way, were supposed to be the young Americans who were supposed to go to Vietnam and fight in the first place. So what we have by the early 70s is we essentially have a no-win war, right? We have soldiers being pulled out through Vietnamization, and we're not actually trying to win the war. So for these soldiers going out in the jungle, their feeling is, why do we want to put our life on the line when we're trying to get out of Vietnam? I've got to serve my 13 months. We don't need to put ourselves in harm's way anymore, right? And what you would have is a lot of younger officers would come into the military with the idea of trying to make rank in the war, right? If you make rank and you move up from a lieutenant, to a first lieutenant and whatnot, you get paid more money. So these young conscripted soldiers would frag their officers, which would basically be they go out of the jungle, and if the young soldiers in a platoon thought that their officers were putting him in harm's way, they would throw a fragmentation grenade at the officer and claim that, oh, he was killed by the Viet Cong in the jungle. Too bad for the guy, right? A second thing that's happening is drug use is rampant in the 1970s in Vietnam at this time. Marijuana grows wild all over Vietnam. So you could literally walk down the road and you could pick marijuana. Also, Southeast Asia is one of the centers of heroin production on the planet, right? And for a lot of soldiers, 1/3 of them by 1971 were using. I mean, hey, I could die anyways from a bullet. What's the problem if I develop a heroin addiction? Well, for those who survived, it became a problem when they came back dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder and having a heroin addiction as well too, right? Another thing about this war that people need to recognize is that the Vietnam War is really, in a lot of ways, an African American war, right? For a lot of people of color, right, they're thinking, why are we fighting a white man's war against people of color, right? In Vietnam, about 40% of the soldiers in Vietnam serving were African American, yet African Americans only make up about 15% of the American population, so they're overrepresented. And one of the largest, the most famous protester against the war at this time was probably Muhammad Ali, right? Now, Muhammad Ali, who's originally Cassius Clay, converted to the Nation of Islam, right? And he was drafted in the 60s and he refused to fight. Now, he could do so because of his religious convictions. He had joined the Nation of Islam. He says it's against my religious beliefs to fight, and the U.S. government said yes, that's correct. You change your name to Muhammad Ali and whatnot, right? But it was the backlash against him by ordinary Americans that really stands out. He was forced to lose his heavyweight title at his peak when he was inarguably probably the greatest fighter of all time. And he lost years of his ability to fight, to earn money, and his popularity. People told him all the time that he was a coward and he should be doing his part to fight this war. Now, my question about this is this: Muhammad Ali really stood up for his values, and he lost millions and millions of dollars. And arguably, you could say he ended up fighting in the late 70s and extending his career to try to make up for some of that money that he might have lost, which caused him to have Parkinson's disease and other long-term de- debilitations to his health. Okay, but did Muhammad Ali make the right decision by refusing to fight and losing millions of dollars in potential earnings? Now, at the time, the majority of Americans said, no way. He was branded a coward, right? And he lost millions of dollars. But today, people look at Muhammad Ali as being arguably one of the greatest athletes in American history because he did stand up for his convictions. He was, in a sense, rewarded for this feeling today, that we find him to be a a person who believes himself when he lit the Olympic torch in the 1996 Olympics at the Atlanta Games. And he received a standing ovation from everybody in the United States when that happened. But another question was, what do you think? Would athletes today do the same thing? Would a Kobe Bryant, sorry, he just recently passed away, but he's probably the most famous athlete, most famous recent athlete in Los Angeles, or LeBron, would they be willing to lose millions of dollars to stand up for something they believed in? Now, here's a quick story about Kobe Bryant and him maybe not standing up for his beliefs. Kobe Bryant is amongst was and still is probably amongst the most popular athletes on the planet. And he is the most popular athlete in China. And China is a country that practices human rights abuses, right? He also, right shortly before he retired, took a contract with Turkish Air, as well did Lionel Messi, right? And the thing about it was Turkish Air from Turkey is a country that still refuses to accept the fact that it committed the first genocide of the 20th century when Turkey killed hundreds of thousands of Armenians. Now, this was important in Los Angeles because Los Angeles has one of the largest Armenian populations outside of Armenia, right? And for a lot of Armenian Laker fans, they were insulted by the fact that Kobe Bryant took a contract to make money from an airline that was supported by a country that murdered Armenians. So Kobe Bryant was willing to make money off of groups that did commit human rights violations on groups of people. Muhammad Ali refused to and lost millions of dollars and the best years of his life. Now, the end of the war. The U.S. finally pulls out in 1973. So this is 5 years after Nixon became president of the United States, right? And in 1975, the North Vietnamese communists take over South Vietnam. So this is what happened, right? America loses its first war because the goal was to stop the spread of communism, and the communists end up winning. Now, the cost of this war was for the United States, and this is the number we always throw around all the time, is how many Americans died in Vietnam? 57,000 Americans died in about a 10-year period in Vietnam. Okay, 300,000 wounded, right? For the Vietnamese, well over 5 million people dead and 6.5 million people homeless, right? And when the war's over, the US slid in recession, and we slid into doubt for another 15, 20 years until Ronald Reagan becomes president after losing our first war. We really had a period where America was the richest country, the affluent society. In the 1970s, when this war ends, partially as a result of spending all this money on the war, right? America is no longer going to be, well, we're still going to be the richest country in the world, but not the inarguable 800-pound gorilla that is the largest country in the world and can do what it wants to, as well as the fact we can't win anything we want, right? And the number 57,000 dead people usually use as a reference of how bad something is. So when recently in the COVID-19 crisis, the death rate just went over 100,000 people. People are now saying that's the combination of the number of dead in Vietnam and Korea. And this was just in 3 months in the United States, right? Korea was a 3-year-long war. Vietnam was a 10-year-long war. So last question is, analyze what lesson did the U.S. learn from the war in Vietnam and evaluate if we've learned our lesson. And the lesson America was supposed to learn from this war is we don't always have to get involved in all of the conflicts in the world. We do not have to be the world's policeman, right? And trying to be the world's policeman either to always try to further the ideals of human rights or equality or our own capitalistic intentions, right? It can cause lots of countries around the world to start having bad feelings towards America, right? And the idea here is that America should not always get involved in foreign conflicts. Of course, there have been multiple occasions where America has got involved in foreign conflicts, in particular Afghanistan now after 9/11, right? America was attacked at 9/11, and America went in to Afghanistan to try to get Al-Qaeda and to crush the Taliban, which is a fundamentalist Islamic group that tries to limit human rights, especially for women. And America is about to leave Afghanistan after well over 15, actually almost 19 years now. And the Taliban will probably take over Afghanistan again, so we might have lost. And another one was obviously the war in Iraq. America went in Iraq at the cost of $1 trillion and the lives of about 3,000 Americans, right, in an attempt to try to control the Middle East and bring some peace to the Middle East. All those things that we do around the world come at the expense of American dollars and American lives. And that's what people need to keep in mind from the Vietnam in the future is when America gets involved internationally, how many lives are we willing to risk and how much money are we willing to risk? as you could say about the COVID-19 at home, how many lives is America willing to risk, and how much money is America willing to put into the economy to try to help America get through this crisis? And that's it for today, guys. Have a good day.